Daniel was always a reserved person who enjoyed solitude and calm. After moving into a new home, he decided to buy some decor items from an antique shop downtown. Among the various pieces, a particular mirror caught his attention. It was old, with a wooden frame carved in intricate details that resembled interwoven faces and somber arabesques. The glass, slightly fogged with age, held a mysterious appearance, as if it guarded ancient secrets. Without overthinking, he decided the mirror would be the centerpiece of his bedroom, a space he considered his sanctuary. Once home, he hung the mirror on the wall next to his bed, where he could see it each night before he slept. Admiring his reflection, he felt pleased with his choice. The mirror gave his room an elegant, unique touch. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. Daniel spent his nights reading or watching TV, occasionally glancing at the mirror, seeing only his own reflection. But one day, something strange happened. He noticed that the reflection in the mirror seemed slightly delayed. When he moved, there was a tiny lapse before the reflection did the same. Intrigued, Daniel moved closer and tilted his head side to side. The reflection followed, but it seemed hesitant, almost independent. He laughed to himself, convinced he was just tired and that his eyes were playing tricks. Maybe it's just the lighting, he thought, shrugging. But the discomfort lingered, growing each time he looked at the mirror. He tried to brush it off, assuring himself it was just his imagination. As days passed, the feeling of strangeness only intensified. Some nights, when he looked in the mirror, he had the impression that his reflection smiled subtly, even though his lips remained still. Other times, it seemed the reflection watched him with an inquisitive expression, different from his neutral look. That figure that was supposed to be an exact reflection of himself was beginning to resemble something else. One night, when he was almost asleep, a sudden discomfort made him open his eyes. He turned toward the mirror and, for a brief moment, had the impression that his reflection was watching him as he slept. He tried to push the thought away, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something deeper and more dangerous lay beyond the glass surface. Something that was observing and waiting on the other side. Night after night, Daniel became more unsettled. Every time he glanced at the mirror, something seemed wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what. It was as though the reflection had a life of its own, a hidden intention that grew day by day. One particularly quiet night, Daniel was brushing his teeth in the bathroom when he decided to take a glance at the mirror in his bedroom through the half-open door. His reflection was there, motionless. But as he turned to leave the bathroom, the reflection seemed to continue watching him for a second longer, staring at his back. He froze, then stepped back to look closer at the mirror, staring at his own image, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion. But the discomfort was real. Determined to prove it was only his mind playing tricks, Daniel began testing his reflection, making small gestures, raising an eyebrow, tilting his head, smirking. At first, the reflection followed normally, but suddenly it stopped. For a moment, the reflection observed him with a vacant expression, refusing to mirror his apprehensive gaze. Daniel's stomach tightened as he saw himself staring back with an indifferent look, making him feel like a stranger to himself. With a chill running down his spine, Daniel stepped away from the mirror and headed straight to bed, determined to forget what he had seen. "I'm just imagining things," he told himself, pulling the covers over himself and turning his back to the mirror. But as he tried to fall asleep, the sensation of being watched weighed heavily on him. Every night that passed, the reflection seemed to gain more independence, becoming stronger. Daniel began to avoid looking directly at the mirror. Something in it made him feel a heightened sense of alertness, a profound and unexplainable fear. Then, one early morning, when silence filled the room, he woke up suddenly. The moonlight illuminated the room, and his eyes instinctively turned to the mirror. His reflection was standing, eyes locked on him with a look of curious malice, an expression he would never associate with himself. Daniel's heart raced, and he looked away, his breath quickening with fear. He knew, deep down, that there was something beyond that polished glass, something that didn't want to be just a reflection. Every night, the reflection in the mirror became more threatening. Daniel tried to ignore the growing discomfort, but the reflection seemed more alive each day, showing expressions that didn't match his own. He started avoiding the mirror altogether, almost unable to bear seeing himself staring back with that sinister expression. Soon the nightmares began. He dreamed that he was trapped inside the mirror, watching his own figure from the outside, as if there was an impenetrable barrier between him and the real world. In the dream, he screamed, pounded on the glass surface, trying to get his own self to notice him, but his self outside ignored every plea. The sense of helplessness and despair in the dream was so intense that he woke up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his body covered in sweat. One morning, after another night of nightmares, Daniel woke up feeling profoundly exhausted, as if he was being drained by that presence. He realized that, when he looked in the mirror, his reflection bore a faint, malicious smile, while he remained expressionless and weary. It was as though the reflection was finding joy in his suffering. Gradually, Daniel began to fear that the mirror was awakening something dark within him, a part of himself he had never acknowledged. He questioned if these expressions and looks were reflections of his own hidden traits, or if the mirror was somehow possessed. In desperation, he tried covering the mirror with a sheet. But even with the mirror covered, he felt watched. The presence seemed to have infiltrated his mind, as if the reflection knew his every thought, each insecurity, every weakness. The days grew long, and the nights unbearable. Every glance at the mirror intensified his fear, and the nightmares, becoming more vivid, left him restless. Daniel knew the reflection wasn't a coincidence, wasn't just his imagination playing tricks on him. He was facing something much more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. One night, after yet another nightmare, he decided he couldn't run from it any longer. It was time to confront whatever was on the other side of the mirror, even if it meant facing a dark part of himself he had never wanted to admit. That night, Daniel gathered the courage to face the mirror, determined to resolve the mystery once and for all. He approached slowly, his heart pounding and his hands shaking until he was just inches from the glass. He looked directly into his reflection's eyes, and it stared back with the same intensity, but with a slight smirk full of cruelty and disdain. "What do you want from me?" Daniel murmured, his voice weak and raspy. To his surprise, the reflection tilted its head, still smiling, as if it understood the question. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The reflection wasn't just a mirror, it was like another version of him, a darker side that seemed to challenge his existence. Suddenly, the reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the glass, and Daniel, hypnotized, did the same. The moment their hands touched the glass at the same time, he felt a cold shock run through his body. The reflection stared back intensely, and then, with a subtle movement, it stepped backward as if inviting him in. Daniel felt an irresistible pull, as though he were being drawn into the mirror. His body leaned toward the surface, and before he could react, he found himself being sucked inside. It was like crossing a dense, cold barrier, and then he found himself on the other side, trapped inside the mirror, looking at his room from a distorted perspective. His reflection was now on the outside, watching him with a satisfied look. Daniel realized, panicked, that their roles had reversed. He was imprisoned inside the mirror, while the entity, his darker version, had taken control of the real world. Daniel screamed, pounding on the glass, but his reflection ignored him. Like a shadow, it turned and began exploring the room, touching Daniel's belongings with a cold, almost mocking curiosity, as if it was experiencing life for the first time. Daniel felt his helplessness turn to despair. He was a prisoner in the mirror, and his own existence was under the control of a side of himself he had never wanted to face. Inside the mirror, Daniel knew he had to confront this dark side. He focused all his willpower, fixing his gaze on the reflection, refusing to let it dominate him. With clenched fists, he stared intently, willing himself to accept and confront these dark aspects of his personality without letting them consume him. The reflection stopped, as if hesitating, then slowly turned back to face Daniel. The previously cruel expression now seemed to waver, as if losing strength. Daniel felt the glass warm beneath his hand, and a surge of energy coursed through him, pulling him back outside. With one final effort, he broke through the mirror and collapsed onto his bedroom floor, gasping in shock. When he looked at the mirror again, he He saw only his own reflection, still and harmless, as it always should have been. But deep in his eyes, he knew that the shadow of his dark side